morning, Javad, Gong Yong, and everyone else, and fellow classmates. This morning I'll be presenting on the stroke prediction classification. This is the agenda for the presentation. We start off the business problem, look at the data set, and look at how we analyze the data set, and then the findings, next steps, and the references. Firstly, the business problem. What is stroke? Stroke is a brain attack, and that causes us to lose functions in the body. And that is very serious because in Singapore, stroke is the fourth most common cause of death, accounting for more than 10%. Yeah. So it's not just in terms of the cause of, as in the fatality rate is high, but also the economic cost of stroke is also very high. Every year, Singapore spends about 2 to 4% of its total healthcare expenditure to deal with stroke. If you give us a sense of how much that is, that's about $400 to $500 million a year. That's how much money is spent to deal with stroke. And that figure is going to increase almost double by 2030 or 2040 because the population is aging very fast. So for a stroke patient, the direct medical cost is about $12,000. That's also very high. So you can see that not just the cost to patient life, but also the economic cost to the nation and to the patient is also very high. So what are we going to do about it? The health authority in Singapore is interested to develop a stroke predictor to, of course, identify patients with stroke and to also as part of efforts to bring down the overall healthcare costs. And therefore, it engages company ABC to undertake this development. The data is being compiled with live patient data based out of Singapore. But for purpose of this initial analysis, you're going to take a look at one of the sample data set from Kegel. The whole purpose of this initial analysis is to understand what we should look out for eventually when you have the actual patient data. So this is like a pre-preparation for what is to come. Now on accuracy, the whole purpose, like any disease, is to make sure that we capture as much of the relevant data as possible. So sensitivity is very key. And then after that is precision. So recall is the key priority and then followed by precision. So the main focus, the target is to capture at least 90% of the true positive, translated into F1 score, that's about 0.9. There are several stakeholders. The direct stakeholders, of course, will be the health authorities in Singapore because we spend $400 to $800 million a year on stroke. Yeah, that is a huge cost to the economy. And also, of course, the indirect stakeholders will be the stroke patient themselves and also the healthcare workers. Now, let's look at the data set. What are we looking at for this initial analysis? It's taken from Kegel. The data set has 5,110 rows with 11 clinical attributes, and these are stated here in this table. Now, before we look at the analysis, we also need to understand that stroke has many causes, and therefore some background study and research needs to be done to understand what causes stroke and how the data compare with what we have learned from intensive research by established medical professionals. So let's look at the overall general observation from the data set that we have collected so far out of these 5,110 patients. Now, if you look at the table on the left, firstly, we find that some general observations, we find that there's on the gender side, there's a little anomaly here, something to look into. And then we discover something very interesting because from medical research, heart disease and hypertension are major causes of stroke. But from the data, out of the 5,110, we see very little of those proportion of stroke in people with heart disease and hypertension. So that suggests that perhaps something needs to be looked further into in terms of the data. It may not accurately represent the true situation on the ground. Another thing we also notice is that it's highly imbalanced. All people with stroke, only 4.8% down with stroke compared to the overall data set. So that means that our data set is highly imbalanced and therefore something to look into as well. Now, when it comes to age and stroke, we can see that as a person grows older, the likelihood of stroke increases. And so that is a general trend that we see here. Also, the average glucose level, as it grows higher, there's a higher risk of stroke because higher glucose level means the blood vessels can burst and that can cause brain damage. One interesting observation we discovered is between the gender proportion. How is a gender proportion affecting the stroke, or how is stroke affecting the different genders? So you can see here at a high level, it seems like for male and female, they are both at equal risk of getting stroke. This is interesting because we always have this preconceived idea that maybe one sex is more at risk than the other, but the data seems to show that both are at equal risk. And finally, we also discovered some null values under BMI. About 201 rows are with null values. So in light of all this, we did some algorithm to do some feature selection, but because from the heat map here, we see that the correlation figures are extremely low for all the features. So that suggests to us that perhaps the data set may not be as good as we want it to be. And further work needs to be done to understand the data set before we go further. But for the purpose of this initial analysis, you still go ahead just to see how it play out in the end. And then it's something to be mindful of when we look at the actual data. So for this machine learning exercise, we have used all the features instead of selecting a few because there are only so few and all of them are actually quite poorly correlated. We do one hot encoding for all the category variables, and the process will also drop one variable. And then we also do something to do the imbalance data. In so doing, we translate the number of rows in the training data from 3008 to 7290 rows. And these are the features that we ultimately select for modeling. There are 15 of them. Now let's look at the results. We have used 3 different algorithms. One is logistics regression, the other one SVM, and the one is naive Bayes. And the result tell us as follow. Bear in mind that our key metric is really F1 score. And we find that with logistic regression, SVM, and naive Bayes, the F1 score is really bad at 0.22. It's understandable because we know that firstly, the data set is not good enough, it's highly imbalanced, but let's see how we can improve this as much as we can. We also see that the wall time for each of these algorithms is also stated here to compare which algorithm is more suitable compared to the rest. Putting all the information together in the ROC curve, this is what we see. We find that actually the curve for the logistic regression and the SVM is actually very close. It doesn't show up here, but actually they are almost overlap each other. Now, what can we do with such a low F1 score? Can we do something about it, even with after-grid search? And one possibility is to look at how we can tune the threshold, because all the thresholds are assumed to be at 0.5%. At 0.5. So what if we can tune the threshold to see whether we can optimize the trade-off between recall and threshold. And so we plot this chart, and if we go with the threshold of 0.85, we can achieve a better F1 score, 0.29. However, the recall dropped from 0.74 to 0.32, which is no good because the trade-off is just too much. We want a higher recall so that we can accurately capture as much of the relevant data as possible. Yes, we may have some false positive, but the cost of false positive is less than the cost of false negative. And therefore, our first priority should be recall. And then next is precision. And then, of course, ideally, both should go up. And therefore, this exercise, we conclude that no, the optimal threshold just doesn't make the cut. what are our findings from all this analysis? Firstly, the data set don't seem to line up with what we study from research. Things like heart disease and hypertension are known to cause stroke, but they are not obvious from the data set. So something to look for, to check in the actual data. The correlation is generally low. Again, something to look out for. And AUC of 0.73 indicates it has a fair discriminatory ability, meaning that it can discriminate between stroke and no stroke. Okay, that's reasonable. But the F1 score is just not good enough, right? 0.22. We tried to improve the F1 score to 0.29 by changing the threshold, but again, we do that at the cost of reduced recall, which is no good. On the algorithm side, we also find that logistic regression and SVM show similar results, but computationally, SVM is 45 times more heavy than logistic regression, and therefore should not be used here. Overall, this exercise on this initial data analysis with the algorithm that we use does not meet the criteria of the F1.9, and therefore they are not suitable for use here. What then can we do? With all those learnings from this exercise, we can use them to apply on the actual data set when these are available from the health authority. Perhaps we need further consultation with the domain experts to understand how to do better and further feature engineering, and explore other algorithms that are more complex and more suitable for imbalanced data. And finally, these are the references that we have looked into in understanding the data set and its conclusions. I'll move forward next to the Jupyter Notebook. So this is a stroke prediction. We import the library, and then from here we can see that there are 200 over now values. So we take care of them. We drop the axis, and then we do a count plot to have a general sense of how the data look like and what are some anomalies that we need to take note of. Okay. We found on the gender, there's one row with gender other, and therefore we remove it and change it to a male because it doesn't move the needle, it's just one. On smoking, we find that yeah, they are unknowns, and then with age, we find that we change that also because children, I assume children below 10 years old don't smoke, so we can move the unknown to known, never smoke. Yeah, so we change that, and then we transform the categorical variables to numerical using one-hot encoding, and also the whole process we also drop one of the variable to reduce the number of features. Okay. And we use on the BMI, because there are about 201 now values, we use KNN imputer to impute those BMI value. Okay, and then after that we get a sense, we look at the minimum maximum to get a sense of whether it is reasonable or not reasonable. Now on age, something that's very interesting, in further study, we realized that stroke can happen even in babies that are not even born, because stroke is actually a bursting of the blood vessel, and it can cause brain damage, and that can happen even before a child is even born. Therefore, we may not have enough confidence to remove children that are from 0 to 1 or 2 years old and above, because there's a likelihood medical wise that they could also get strokes. Okay, and then we come out with the correlation, and you can see that the correlation factor is generally low across all the features. And we use a facet grid plot to understand the relationship between features like age and hypertension and so forth with stroke. Okay, we see that it is imbalanced data, and therefore we need to do something about it. We'll do balancing, normalization, as well as do the feature we call it using SMOD to handle the imbalanced training data. After we do that, we can confirm that the data set in terms of the trained rows have increased to 7290, and then the in terms of the whether it's balanced or not, the Y train you come 50-50, so that shows that it's really balanced. Yeah, but the test one is still remain as it is, because this is our something that we want to test the algorithm with eventually, so it must stay unbalanced. We went on to look at logistic regression and use cross-validation. The score that we use is no longer accurate. I mean, accuracy is based on F1, because that is the metric that we're using for all our discussion here. So we use F1 macro as the as a score, and we find that it's generally not high at 0.7 plus. Yeah, so we do the same for SVM. F1 macro is the score metric in evaluating the model. So this is an initial view using all the features and using the scoring as F1 macro. And then after that, we find that it's not good enough. We went to use grid search to do the hyperparameter tuning on both logistic regression and SVM. And we plot out the final results here. And we tried to see whether we can improve the threshold. And this is the attempt that we did. By the end, we dropped this approach. So this is the end of the presentation. Are there any